You're listening to the Mind Flipping Podcast, where you'll find tools and tips to help you renovate and update your mind and life.
Mark, thanks again so much for being on the Mind Flipping Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be back.
Yeah, as listeners heard in the intro, this is episode 100. You know, when I started the podcast, I set the intention to do 200, just kind of put blinders on and somehow do it. So I'm halfway there, and I'm super excited. In a lot of ways, I didn't know I'd get to 100, didn't know if. But as listeners heard in the intro, you were hand-selected, and I'm so glad you said, yeah, I'll come back. Because in many ways, your podcast, your interview with me and your book and all that you've done has really been impactful, not only on me professionally, there's definitely an impact there, but personally. So thank you again.
I'm so glad to hear that. So
you were episode 77, which is a cool coincidence, you know, and the people in your field will say, oh, there aren't coincidences, you know, there's numerology and things. And so 77 is one of my favorite numbers. It's my wife's birthday, July 7th. And it was just by chance that you were episode 77. So if listeners haven't heard, you know, go back and check out episode 77, but can you do kind of a quick summary about how we connected, or more importantly, you know, about your book and End Upside Down Thinking and what led to that?
Sure. So my background is in the business world. I'm a partner at a Silicon Valley strategy firm called Sherpa Technology Group. Prior to that, I worked in investment banking in New York. So my background on the surface has nothing to do with consciousness, and yet I ended up writing a book and came out with a podcast on the topic of consciousness. That all started for me in August of 2016. I heard a podcast initially that sparked my interest, which then led me to listen to other podcasts, which then led me to read books. And then it kind of spiraled where I spent a year doing basically nothing other than my day job and researching, just because I wanted to understand these topics. And at the end of that year, I decided to write a book, which is called An End to Upside Down Thinking, which was published. It was written in the summer of 2017. It was published in October of 2018. And in the summer of 2019, I released my podcast, which is called Where Is My Mind, featuring interviews with many of the people that I write about in my book.
And the podcast is fantastic. 8 episodes?
Yes, 8 episodes, and it's a narrative form series.
And then you have some incredible bonus audio, so hour-long interviews with a lot of those guests. Really, really impressive guest list. And in fact, just last night I was digging into Third Eye Mind, Russell Targ, his movie.
Yes.
Yeah, about remote viewing, and it's also cool. So again, listeners, to get into it more, check out episode 77. But I want to, instead of talking about all we talked about then and the book, you know, we'll touch on pieces. I'm wondering, one of the first questions I wanted to ask you is, what do you think, what grabbed you, what captured you? You know, I think you heard maybe Laura Powers on a different podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And so what about that? Like, I'm wondering, were you at a point in your life where you were open to it? You know, what do you think was the tipping point? Like, what brought you there and then, you know, led you to keep going?
I think about that a lot. I heard, like you said, Laura Powers on a show called Extreme Health Radio. So I was listening to an alternative health show. I had also been listening to some business podcasts and really just getting into podcasts for the first time after some friends recommended podcasts. And I realized they were an awesome way to learn about a topic from experts in different fields. And it was all free. So I just went on to Apple Podcasts and started listening around and got to Extreme Health Radio, which I was just listening to the next podcast in the queue. And it was a woman named Laura Powers who talked about her own psychic abilities and her ability to communicate with non-physical beings and things that I had never really heard a person talk about in a serious way. And I would say that episode didn't change my life per se, but it got me interested enough to then download Laura's podcast, which is called Healing Powers. And I listened to that show driving from San Francisco to San Mateo, which is where my office is. And in a few weeks, I had listened to most of the interviews on her show, dating all the way back to the early years of 2011 when she started the show.
Wow.
And so something about listening to the people she interviewed intrigued me. And I remember at first even listening to her show, it wasn't like my worldview was shifted, but somehow within those few weeks, I started to realize that if what the people were saying had some truth to it, then I needed to rethink things in a big way. So it was kind of the accumulation of hearing a lot of different people say a very similar thing, which then led me to start reading and researching even more. And the more I researched, the more I kind of couldn't go back to my old worldview because I had been exposed to more and more evidence.
It's almost like every podcast you listen to was just stacking on another, like a little bit more
Yeah,
interest or wonder or enough to
that's
keep
a,
you coming back.
that's a great way to put it. It was a very incremental process where each thing I learned kind of took me a few steps forward, and then I would go back to my daily life and kind of forget about those topics because on a day-to-day basis we don't see many of the things that I like to investigate. They're kind of counterintuitive, they're beyond ordinary perception, and I would forget about them. And then I would listen to another podcast or read another book and say, "Wait, I can't forget about these things because that might be the nature of reality." And it was kind of that internal conflict that led me to want to understand things better.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of how you just said that it's not in our normal everyday perception. So that's why it is easy to forget about it, difficult to continue because in so many ways, it doesn't make sense.
Exactly. And
Mhm.
that's why I think ideas that don't appeal to what our eyes show us or what our ears allow us to perceive, they're just harder to understand. It takes kind of an intellectual step and effort to reorient the mind, unless someone has a direct personal experience, which is much easier to grapple with because then you're confronted with it. Otherwise, it's more of an intellectual exercise, which is just, I think it takes more time.
So for, I guess, a little bit more clarity for people that may be just jumping on and haven't heard episode 77 or anything like this, I think your subtitle is kind of the next level, dispelling the myth that the brain produces consciousness and the implications for everyday life. So can you take it next step beyond that subtitle and kind of summarize, you know, what this is about, what we're referring to when we say
Sure.
our senses can't perceive this?
So when I say consciousness, I'm referring to our subjective inner experience or awareness. When I say that I am speaking right now, that sense of being is what I mean by consciousness. And there is a big question in science. It's actually called the hard problem of consciousness. And Science Magazine has said it's the number 2 question that remains in all of science, which is, paraphrasing, how is it that our brain can create this subjective thing that we call consciousness? And what I argue in my book and also in my podcast is the reason that we haven't solved this question is that we've asked the wrong question. The question assumes that the brain does make consciousness in the first place, and then it asks how the brain could do it. What I'm arguing, which is what others argue as well, is that the brain doesn't make consciousness at all. So the analogy that I use in my book and in the podcast is to say that we should imagine all of reality is like a stream of water, and this comes from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. And in this stream, there are whirlpools, meaning localizations of the water. So I'm a whirlpool. Anyone listening is a whirlpool. We have these personalized experiences, but we're fundamentally connected as part of the same stream of consciousness. So it implies there's an interconnectedness, and it also implies things like psychic abilities. So water from one whirlpool getting into another whirlpool, that's like consciousness from one person getting into another person. That's like a psychic ability. This model would predict that psychic abilities should occur. The model also predicts that when a whirlpool stops being a whirlpool, when it delocalizes, the water just flows back into the broader stream. It changes form, but it doesn't leave the stream. In other words, when our physical body dies, ceases to function, our consciousness doesn't die, it just changes form. So those are predictions of the model. And then what I spend the podcast and the book doing is looking at the evidence for those phenomena, for psychic phenomena like telepathy, and also the survival of consciousness beyond the body. And these are things that are kind of hard to grasp with our ordinary perceptions, but what I was shocked to learn there's a lot of science that actually supports those ideas.
Yeah, there's science now. There's been, through traditions, through centuries, have pointed to this. In a lot of ways, science has pointed away, religions have pointed away from it. So there's this weird mix of a group of, this awareness that, yeah, of course, kind of like we've heard the duh, yeah, consciousness doesn't come from the brain. And then the other side where no way, because we can't, it's an interesting mix. And for me, what helps explain it in my mind and to others, that the shorter leap are some of the examples that you use where you think about somebody and they call you. or you call them, or you get a text, or just those weird, we might call coincidences or unexplained things where we have a dream about somebody and something happens, or we predict something through a dream. What are some other things like that, that most of us can relate to that may kind of strengthen this model?
Well, I like what you mentioned about thinking of someone and then getting a text or a phone call from a person. And there actually have been a number of studies that show statistically there is a real effect. So it's not something that happens 100% of the time, even in a laboratory setting, but it happens beyond what chance would predict. And that actually conforms with our everyday experience because we don't know, we're not telepathic all the time. Otherwise, I would know what everyone's thinking all the time. So the classic study is, and the one that's been repeated the most, is called the Gansfeld experiment. And the basic design is you have two people separated in their different rooms. One person is Bob, and Bob is put into a very relaxed state. He's just in the room chilling out. And then Jane is in another room far away. Jane is shown a picture or some kind of a movie, some image by the experimenters, and the experimenters ask Jane to try to mentally send what she's looking at to Bob in the other room. So after she does this for a while, Bob comes out of his relaxed state and he's shown 4 images. And the experimenters say, "Hey, Bob, which of the 4 was Jane trying to mentally send to you?" Now, if there were no effect at all, we would expect that Bob would guess correctly 1 out of 4 times, or 25%. It should approach 25% after thousands of trials.
Right.
That's what you'd predict. But it's actually closer to 32 or 33% over many decades, many experimenters, which when you run the numbers, the odds that that's happening just due to chance is more than 1 billion to 1, which suggests that some kind of information is being telepathically transmitted in a subtle way.
So cool. And as you point out in your podcast, at first blush, you might think, well, 33% isn't very high, but the statistical difference is huge from 25 to 33, that it's almost beyond doubt. I mean, statistically it is far beyond.
Well, in other areas of science, statistics like that are accepted, like a real effect is just shown to be accurate. And because this is such a controversial area, there's been more resistance. But I should add that Dr. Jessica Utz, who in 2016 was the president of the American Statistical Association, so objectively she knows statistics, what she said in a report when US Congress and the CIA asked her about psychic phenomena, she says, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. That's a direct quote from her report.
Yeah. Wow, that's so cool. And as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the other examples that, that resonated with me are those times where you feel like somebody's looking at you and you turn and somebody's looking at you, right? Don't you kind of bring that up?
The sense of being stared at. And Dr. Rupert Sheldrake has studied this in a lab setting and shows that people know when they're being stared at beyond what chance would predict, even if they're not in the same room, if someone's looking through a camera at the person. So there's something, again, that is being transmitted that we don't see with our eyes, but it's subtle. It's not 100% of the time in these studies. It's just statistically an effect.
Right. And it's so subtle that it's easy to blow it off. But statistically, you can't blow it off. It's incredible.
That's how science works, is that we look for effects beyond chance and then incorporate them into our theories. And that's just objectively what seems to be happening here.
Yeah. And, as you were giving your intro and talking about where you are now, where you came from, I was thinking, in so many ways, this makes you the perfect one to write this book, right? Have you heard that?
I've heard that. And it's part of the way I constructed the book was really to appeal to people that might not be as comfortable with these topics because of my background. So I might be able to relate to people who have a similar background to mine. Yeah. And might be very resistant to these ideas, just like I was. So the language that I try to use and the language also that I avoid is directly related to the language that appeals and doesn't appeal to me.
Right. Gotcha. The other thing that just popped into my head that as I was listening to your podcast, I was reminded of, you talk a little bit about the studies around twins and the connection, they connect to their consciousness beyond, what would make sense. And my wife is a twin. And while this wasn't about thought, it was more about an event. She, as a child, I think she was 8 or 9, was out playing or whatever, approached a dog and got bitten by the dog on the inside of her right thigh. Went home, showed her mom what happened. Her twin sister just got home. Same thing happened to her.
Hmm.
Never happened. Same day, same time, same place. It's like, come on,
Yeah.
I
Hard
can't
to-
explain it. It's just pretty cool. So speaking of how perhaps you're the perfect one to write this, again, for any questions, as always, with all guests, you could say, I don't, guess I'd rather not answer that. But what's your background? Was this a big leap for you, like maybe spiritually or because in many ways it's a spiritual concept.
Mm-hmm. Huge leap. Huge.
Okay.
I was the opposite of anything spiritual.
Okay.
I thought there was no meaning to life. We are all chance occurrences that emerge from a random universe. When we die, it's over, and that's it. And that was, I guess, based on the science excuse me, the science I've been exposed to. And when I saw new science, my worldview shifted.
Very cool. And so another question I was thinking about that kind of relates to our topic is the thought of free will. What are your thoughts on free will and where that fits in to your research?
It's a good question, and I think it's a complicated subject because in some ways the concept of free will is a human construct. So I think first it's important to define what free will is. So let's make sure we're on the same page. How do you think about free will?
Yeah. So it is a human construct, and so there's that fine line between what you're talking about and Rupert Spira. Am I pronouncing his name right? The concepts of non-duality and how we aren't individuals. So
Right.
the concept of free will would assume that we are individuals and that we have the ability to choose our course of action. That we're born in the world, and from there, we we make choices. I guess that's how I would define it.
And I think that's a common definition of the notion of free will. The way I think about reality, as I mentioned before, is that it's something like the stream of consciousness, or as Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, said, in truth, there is only one mind. So Dr. Bernardo Kastrup also uses an analogy saying that it's sort of like the one mind is having a dissociative personality disorder, where each whirlpool is like a dissociation off of the one mind. But in truth, there is only that one mind. And I think that's the key point, that at the highest level of reality, the individual is only an interpretation. And that's really hard to grasp because it feels like we're so individual. And if you buy into all of that, then at the level of the stream of consciousness, at the level of one mind, because that's all of reality, then there's infinite free will at that level. So that's the way I think about it. Then when we start talking about individuals, I think it's beyond human comprehension, because even the individual is not something that's actually real in the way we conceive of it. And therefore, to answer the question about free will is a faulty endeavor almost.
Yeah. I was listening to, is it Larry Dossey's One Mind?
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was quoting Alan Watts, saying that, trying to answer some of these questions is like the eye trying to look at the eye, or a tooth trying to bite a tooth.
Yeah, I think that's what it comes down to. So in the creation of the question, we've created a construct that might not actually exist. So that's why I'm always resistant to that question, even though it's one that I think about all the time, because I'm wondering, where are my actions and thoughts coming from? What's driving my behavior? And the minute we start thinking about those topics, I think we're maybe not thinking about them from the right viewpoint.
Yeah. Yeah. Which can be a challenge when you dig into this. You were referred to me by Dr. Edith Ubuntu Chan when I asked her about, after her mystical experience, blissful experience, I asked her, where does consciousness come from? And she said, you need to talk to Mark. And one of the things that she brought up that I hear from a lot of people, like after near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences, is that it brings up questions that can get in the way of everyday life, like how do you get through the world? There's a little bit of that dark period perhaps for some people. Have you experienced that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When I first started this process, I guess the best word I would use is that I was disoriented. I didn't know how to think about myself and the world around me and the people around me in this new context. So at first it was very difficult to just function, and then also to talk to people, because I didn't know that other people were interested in these topics beyond just who I heard on podcasts and who I read about. And now I've learned that there are many people that have known about this stuff for a long time. So I think the isolation was difficult in the beginning, and then just also the sense of being so unsure. And there's a saying, I think it might be a Buddhist saying, something along the lines of, at first you see mountains and rivers, and then when you learn about all the stuff that we're discussing, they all disappear. And then the mountains and rivers come back, but you just see them from a different viewpoint. And I feel like that's kind of where I am now. There was a period where everything disappeared and I didn't know anything. And now I still feel like I don't know that much, but I'm more reintegrated into society and have accepted the fact that maybe I can't know certain things.
Yeah. I like that. That's very good. Yeah, because I've felt that a little bit of the disorientation, and I try to keep, it's almost like, the 2 feet, 1 foot in real world and 1 foot in the exploring world. And I think what helps bring me back, your interviews with Danyan
Brinkley. Mm-hmm.
And the life review and the possible implications or impact of our actions while we're here. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a really critical topic. And in the 8-episode podcast series, there's a full episode devoted to the life review topic because I think it's so critical. So the life review is something that's often reported during a near-death experience. And a near-death experience is an instance where a person has some kind of physical trauma, and yet they have a lucid consciousness. So in the most extreme cases, the brain is actually off, like in cardiac arrest. Scientists know certain things happen to the brain and it shouldn't be functional, and yet people are reporting a lucid consciousness during that time. Sometimes they're reporting events like from outside their body that is time-stamped during the time that they know the brain was off because they have medical records. So those are the cases where you have a functional consciousness and a dysfunctional body, which is one of the pieces of evidence suggesting that consciousness isn't coming from the brain. And actually, during the near-death experience, people report an expanded consciousness, like they can perceive more. They have omnidirectional 360-degree vision. They describe things as clearer than usual or more logical than usual, all during a time when the brain is barely functional or off.
In other rooms, places.
Yes. Yeah. Other realms or other rooms, they see things accurately in other rooms, sometimes in the most convincing cases. So this is all pointing to the idea that the brain is not producing consciousness. It's related to consciousness, but it's actually the restricting mechanism. It's like a filtering mechanism. And when you get the brain out of the way, like in a near-death experience, or more subtly during meditation, perhaps.
Hypnosis.
Yes, hypnosis is another way. Exactly. Trance-like states. Anything to calm the mind down to get the brain out of the way, people report an expanded reality. So that's the near-death experience. And one of the things people report is a life review during this time when their brain's basically off. And the life review is when they relive their whole life in a flash. And they relive events not only through their own eyes, but through the eyes of the people that they impacted during their life. And sometimes they feel the third order effects. So they feel the impact that their action had on someone close to the person that they affected. So you mentioned Danyan Brinkley. He's someone I interviewed who has had 4 near-death experiences, which is rare on its own, but it's also rare that each time he had a life review, and each time the life review started from the beginning of his life. So there were certain things he relived 4 times, and many of those things were not very pleasant because he fought in Vietnam in combat. He told me that he was vicious, and so he had to relive the deaths of the people that he killed, and he felt the pain of the child that no longer had a father because he had killed the person's father. And he had to relive those things 4 times. So his whole life changed after his near-death experience. He became much less materialistic, which is typical from a near-death experience survivor, and he became a hospice volunteer. So for him, everything in life is about how we're treating people and the joy that we can bring to people, because we feel that in the life review as well. And it's not just him that's saying this. There are many other people that report a life review. It's been reported throughout centuries. The near-death experience is a common occurrence that's been reported. But in the last few decades, we're getting more reports because our medical technology is getting better. So we're bringing more people back through resuscitation, and therefore the number of accounts is increasing in the millions.
And because of people like you, and there's an openness and awareness to, let's talk about it, let's record it, let's not ignore it, let's dig into it a little bit more.
It's really important that people at least know the possibility that these things exist. Because when I talk to the researchers, and these are people like Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, Dr. Ed Kelly from the University of Virginia, who has a Harvard PhD, those are the kinds of scientists that I interviewed and that I talk about in my book, who have spent their careers looking at this. And they have a hard time coming up with explanations other than consciousness is beyond our body. We have to reconsider reality in a big way, and we have to think about the implications, because it seems like the life review might just be part of the living and dying process, whether we like it or not. And if that is true, then how does that impact how we act in the world on a daily basis?
Yeah. And one of the things that he said, or you said, or that came up in the conversation that I like, that aligns with who I want to be, and longtime listeners of the podcast probably get tired of me talking about one of my favorite quotes from Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, and I'm shorting it and paraphrasing it, but he said, that in his opinion, deep and simple is much more essential than shallow and complex.
Mm-hmm.
And that the world isn't about things, but about relationships and people. And that's what Daniel is saying. It's the little things, it's the deep, the simple things that he saw the impact, the exponential, incredible impact, the holding the door, the being kind, all those things that, that we really, I guess, make who we are. And that's what we see at the end of our life, perhaps.
Exactly. That's what's reported repeatedly, is that the little things are actually the big things in the life review. So how much money someone made is not the thing that people are reviewing as much during their life review. They're looking at how they treated the cashier. And one of the examples, Dr. Jan Holden, who's a scientist on these topics from the University of North Texas, she told me about a life review case where a woman, I think it was a woman, relived not being very nice to a cashier. And then the cashier was not as nice to all the people in the line afterwards. And then she got to see the ripple effects in the life review of that unloving action towards the cashier and what that did beyond that individual interaction.
Yeah, it's so cool. And again, it's hard for us to fathom. And one of the common themes also is that this happens, quote unquote, almost in an instant. It's not like, that they can comprehend all this, right, in a short amount of earth time, if you will, or.
Yeah, time becomes warped somehow. It happens in the near-death experience state, but it's something that Albert Einstein talked about. When people are, for example, moving at very fast speeds, time moves differently. Or when there's a lot of gravity, time moves differently. So it's called time dilation in the theory of relativity, which is one of the pointers to the idea that time, as we perceive it, isn't the way it actually is. And in this, maybe another dimension of consciousness, like a near-death experience, something happens where people can relive their whole life through multiple perspectives in a short amount of time.
Right. Wild. So a couple of things that I want to ask you as you talk about, a lot of these high level, professionals, well-credentialed people, and you bring it up in your book and in your podcast, part of the reason that a lot of this stuff didn't come out, that a lot of us haven't heard about it, is, the pushback, if you will. Have you felt that pushback?
Not really so far.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I get, knock on wood. I get some feedback. I get people that reach out to me, but I actually don't hear from all that many people. So it's just kind of an interesting position that I never thought of before writing a book and putting a podcast out, is that many people are taking in the content because I know some of the numbers, but the proportion of people that I actually hear from is very small. So it could be that there are people that were upset by what I'm doing, but I haven't really heard from them.
Yeah. Well, let's hope it stays that way. I mean, not that pushback is terrible, but, can be a bit uncomfortable. And the reason I bring it up, because in many ways it's threatening to the identity of a lot of people, especially those who are involved in certain, religions or spiritual beliefs. They
Absolutely
could see it as threatening. And yet on the flip side is if you break it down, a lot of those spiritual beliefs have a lot of similarities. All the things that we talk about are found in many religions.
Yes, there are core messages that seem to be consistent across traditions, and particularly the mystical traditions like Vedanta and Hinduism, non-duality generally, Buddhism, but also Kabbalah and Judaism and Gnosticism, early Christianity, Sufism and Islam. So it's been interesting for me to learn bits and pieces about spiritual traditions and learn how similar their ideas are to what science is now pointing to.
Yeah, very cool. So another question that I have written down that I wanted to ask you is, through your studies here, it's kind of a two-part question. Um, how does your daily life, your activities and your mindset differ now from before you got into this?
It's drastically different. And I think before I got into all this, there was an internal struggle that was occurring because I I understood the implications of my worldview, which is that life had really no meaning at all. And therefore, why did it matter for me to care about anything that happened, whether I was a college tennis player? So if I won a match or lost a match, why should I care? Even though I still did care, I would question my emotions and say, well, Mark, why are you so upset about this? Or why are you so happy you won the match? Or you got a good grade on a test. Why are you so happy about that? Because nothing actually matters in the end. We're all going to be dead. So why do
Yep.
you care?
Right.
So that was the internal struggle. Now I feel very differently about everything because I think, not that I can claim that I know what the meaning of life is, but I'm seeing hints of what it might be. And I don't think it's what it was my old worldview, which is that there is no meaning. I think there's something, and maybe the life review is teaching us a piece of it, in that we're all learning and growing. So, and the life review is a way for us to evaluate how we did in life and how we treated people. So I approach life from that perspective now, that every day is an opportunity for me to grow. And when I say me as my identity as consciousness. So this is one of the key ideas that also impacts my daily life, but just in general is kind of mind-blowing. The notion that our identity is not our body, but our identity is the consciousness that experiences our body. And that impacts how I think about everything, because I view the body kind of as the vehicle to learn and grow and look to transcend whatever blocks I have, and to treat people as well as I can and really contribute, because if we're all connected as part of the same stream of consciousness, then contributions actually do matter.
So is what you're saying, your identity has shifted a little bit from the typical I, Mark Gober, to I consciousness viewed through the lens facet of this being we call Mark?
That's how I look at it, that I am the consciousness that experiences the physical world through Mark, and the essence of that consciousness is the same as the essence of every other person's consciousness. So that which experiences my life, that substrate of existence, of experiencing, is the same substrate that is experiencing Rick's life. It's just that we're in different whirlpools having kind of a different lens.
Yeah. That's where I'm getting to. Again, it's hard to wrap our brain around, but it really, it ends up making more sense than the alternative. Not in this world, not through our senses, but
it's mind-blowing to really think about it. I mean, I've had to sit quietly for a long time to just really incorporate and integrate these ideas. Because if you buy into what we're talking about, then me talking to you is me talking to myself.
Right.
As many spiritual leaders would say, it's awareness speaking to awareness.
Yep.
And when you have that perspective, even though it doesn't feel like we're necessarily exactly the same, it puts a new spin on every interaction.
Totally. And I remember in episode 77, I brought up how much I liked Rupert Spira's definition of love and beauty. And I think that ties into, that recognition of self and other. And it, it's not about romantic love. And in fact, I think I started prior to our episode 77. Instead of giving a major award at the end of podcasts, I tell my guests that I love them and I appreciate them. Because in many ways, I look at them, I'm loving myself when I do that. And I think it's important. I think there's an essence, a spirit there that can only help everything and everybody.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I've spoken about the notion of selfish genes to explain a lot of phenomena in biology. That's what biologists typically use to explain altruistic behavior. So you want to help someone else because it's enabling the survival of your own genes in a certain way. And that's a theory that's been tossed around. And what we're talking about is kind of like the selfish consciousness, that consciousness helping itself or being kind and loving to others is a way of selfishly helping itself. So the way I think about altruism now is that under this context, altruism is the highest form of selfishness.
Wild. Cool. And so I said it's kind of a two-part question, and we've kind of dipped a couple toes in it when I asked you how your life is different. The second part of the question is, have you or would you meditate, try ESP or psychedelics?
So I meditate, and I think meditation is probably the most natural way to achieve altered states of consciousness, or hypnosis, or breathing techniques that many people have done. There are other, more extreme ways. I think the most extreme version would be near-death experience, which I wouldn't recommend because it's not very safe. But for me, meditation has been the chosen route, and sometimes sensory deprivation. So there's sensory deprivation
Have you
float
tried it?
tanks. I have,
And
and I like them a lot. Sometimes the mind definitely wanders, but even if my mind is wandering in that state, I find that it's somehow helpful because the brain is not taking in all the sensory inputs that we're taking in all the time. And also, since you're floating, it's anti-gravity. And something about being in that state is very calming. So I come out and it feels like my brain has gotten a break.
that's cool. I wanted to try it, and I've been running in my mind. I think like the perfect match is to do hypnosis in a float tank, because now we're taking away so many things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, okay. So those things. How about
Yeah.
ESP, psychedelics? You played with either?
I'm not as interested in those other areas. I talk about those topics in the book and the podcast because they point to the theory of consciousness.
Right.
But to me, the ultimate, the stuff that really matters is the identity, and I think how we're treating each other and how we're being in the world. Those other topics are scientific areas that point us in these directions. So that's why I spend a lot of time talking about them. And I actually just had a conversation the other day about this, of people asking particularly about ESP abilities and really harnessing them. And I think it's kind of a distraction to focus on those areas. I don't think it's harmful, but if that becomes the focus, then it's kind of a reinforcement of one's own ego, of having like strong abilities, which then creates a further sense of separation. So my exploration into those areas is really more scientific, and the philosophical stuff of who we are is where I like to spend a lot of my mental energy.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's a great looking at it. Questioning, is this a distraction for you, or do you feel called that this may impact, quote unquote, your incarnate purpose, or your, is it going to help you fulfill perhaps what you're here for, or would it sidetrack you? Would it be a bit of a distraction? Are you doing this for ego, me? Yeah, that's I like
Yeah,
that.
the intent's really important. For someone, it might be important to help solidify the reality of these things. And if that's important for then helping someone develop, then maybe that's okay. But to have the ability to reinforce the ego can actually probably distract someone from a growth path.
Yeah. Yep. Agreed. Because I heard Russell Targ talking about, I think it was him, his book Reality of ESP, and like how he really believes you can train anybody to have those skills, and I thought that was kind of interesting.
I think it's true.
Yeah.
And that's what I hear repeatedly, that these things can be trained. And I felt like in my own life, I've had more experiences that are unexplainable, but there may probably just more consequence of aligning with whatever the reality is. Whereas before I started all this, I was so far away. And I think the more we align with reality, the more things just start to happen spontaneously.
And you're aware of them and you notice them. And so on that note, that was another question I had. Have any kind of what we might call weird or strange coincidences, psychic experience happened to you?
I've had many. And when I first started my journey, I was having a lot of synchronicities where there were coincidences that I was having a hard time reasoning, where I would run the numbers and say, wait, was that really a chance occurrence? And one example, one of my favorites that really, like these were some of the things that pushed me in the direction of having to question reality beyond just doing research. The personal experiences really got me. There was one of the early books I read was by Dr. Gary Schwartz, called The Sacred Promise. And he's a Harvard PhD at the University of Arizona. He studied mediums. And I was reading his book, and he talked about some crazy synchronicities. And I happened to text a friend who kind of knew about some of this, and I didn't have many friends who even knew about these topics. So I texted her and said, have you heard about this guy, Gary Schwartz? Have you read his books? And she said, you're not going to believe this. I'm going to Canyon Ranch Spa tomorrow. And she sent me a flyer of the talk she's going to, which was Synchronicities by Dr. Gary Schwartz.
That's like double level weird.
Double level.
About synchronicities.
About synchronicities. So I've had a lot of things like that, and I would write them all down when I first started, and now they happen so often that I just accepted them and say, oh, there's another one.
Yeah. Almost like a little confirmation or a little, that's cool.
Mhm.
It's
It's a
happening.
reminder. And actually, some people that study these topics claim that when you're more kind of in flow, my friends who are, they have a program called flow consciousness, and I think that's one of the metrics they look at is if you look at the synchronicities happening in your life, it's an indication that you're more in flow,
I like
meaning
it.
you're kind of in alignment.
Yeah. So, again, regular listeners will know I've talked about in some of the episodes, a couple where it was just me that, one of my goals with the podcast and one of my, next level life goals is, I want to kind of, if you will, take the show on the road. I like to travel. I like to travel and teach. And so I've been thinking of a way to to do this. And there's a phrase that's been in my mind. I've written it down. In fact, I wrote it in a little journal I had. It's, as we talked about, for me, the essence of, or the thought of love. And in many ways, I think of consciousness as, and love is kind of the same thing, although that's a word that there's a lot of, it's kind of heavy in a lot of ways. But I've kind of called it like, I'd like to just go on a love tour, and share, teach the impact of love in different levels, self-love. And so that word love tour has been in my head. And then I think it was last week or the week before, my wife sent me a picture of a license plate that said LUV, the number 2, and then RCK, like love to rock. But I saw the love tour on there. I'm like, oh my gosh,
There you go.
I need to take the love tour on the road.
Yeah. Or maybe it's just your daily living. You're
Yeah.
doing it every day.
Yeah. Very true. Very true. This is the tour. And you're absolutely right. So are you, where are you at now? Are you still digging? Are you going next level? Is there going to be a next book, a movie, a series?
I'm often asked that. And right now, as of this recording, I don't have anything definitively planned, which is kind of weird because for so long I've been focusing on researching book, podcast, and now I'm kind of just doing my day job. I'm still reading a little bit, but I'm feeling like the information that I'm getting is much more incremental. Whereas when I first started, I was learning totally new things. So I think a lot of this for me now is embodying as much as I can and being or transmitting the information in the clearest way as possible.
I love it. As you're describing it, I was picturing like before you had the garden hose and it was like, and now you're just going to the bubbler every now and then.
I think so in terms of reading and researching, but daily living we're faced with challenges all the time, no matter how much I think we understand these topics. Being in a human body and feeling like we're individuals has a set of challenges. So I'm constantly focusing on whatever I can do to transcend blocks and be kind of the clearest vessel, conduit, vehicle of consciousness I can be.
Great description. So we haven't heard the sound of spackling. Interesting. There's no spackle round. Longtime listeners will know that the spackle round is a time where we fill in some holes for our listeners. And even longer listeners will remember that in some of the first podcasts, I gave away major awards. And yes, celebrating episode 100, Mark Gober, you are about to get a major award. I want to congratulate you.
Thank you.
You are going to get this. And so Mark and I see each other. In fact, I'll try to get this on YouTube. For podcast listeners, you can go to mindflipping.com, episode 100, and I'll try to get a link in there. I am holding the crystal Siamo. Siamo is the crystal panda. You will get this very soon. Congratulations, Mark. Thank you so much for all that you do. Here is the crystal panda Siamu.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all that you do.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Siamo is an acronym, TSIAMU. And if our listeners are wondering what it's an acronym for, they can email me. Mark, thanks so much. I do love you and I appreciate you. Any last words of people, I guess, they want to get a hold of you? What's the best way?
My website, which is just my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. My book is called An End to Upside Down Thinking, and it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, lots of other bookstores. My podcast is called Where is My Mind, and it's also available on all the major podcast players, Spotify, Apple, Google, Stitcher.
And to get the bonus interviews is at markgober.com/podcast.
Yes. So the podcast itself on Apple and all the major players is an 8-episode series that's narrated by me and my producer, who's kind of playing the skeptic and asking me questions. And in the series, we splice in some of the highlights from my interviews. So you might hear just a few seconds from a scientist. And if you want to hear the full interview that I did, usually they're about an hour long, some are longer, some are shorter. They're available on my website, markgober.com/podcast, or you can go to markgober.com and click on the podcast tab. It's a $33 charge for all currently 50 interviews, and we might add more. So currently it's over 60 hours, and we had to charge a little bit because of editing costs, and I work with producers, and that's just how it had to be. But we wanted to make it reasonable because I think the interviews for me were transformative, even after I'd written the book, to hear so many different people describe similar things and to talk about the science. I think there's something about hearing the person's voice, whereas in my book, I quote a lot of people, which has a certain power. But when you hear a scientist talk about it, or you hear someone who had a near-death experience, there's something that you can't unhear it. And I wanted to make that available to people.
Yeah, there's that stickiness to it. It really hits you in the core, and it is impactful. Just a last thought. It may be Rupert Spira and probably perhaps many other ones. In my mind, the implications of the effect when we hear these things, when we learn it, do come down to world peace, the human race, if you will, and in so many ways. And so it's wonderful, powerful information that that $33 your time is a great investment.
And if not, the 8-episode season is available for free on all the players. But like you said, I think that is the idea of what does this mean for society and how do we interact as a culture. That's ultimately why I'm doing all this. The science is really interesting and it points in this direction, but where it leads us is in a much more philosophical direction as we think about where society is heading and many of the problems that we see in the world. At least for me, those problems that we see, whether they're interpersonal, problems between nations, even personal problems, they can stem from a misunderstanding of reality and a belief that we're finite beings who are separate. And if those assumptions are wrong, what does that mean about how we run a society?
Yeah, 100%. Thanks again, Mark. I appreciate all that you do.
Thank you.